Hello everyone! Welcome to Pathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome and we're glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back and thank you so much for your continued support. My last video was about how casters are not meant to be your cheerleaders in this game. This video is a continuation of that, talking about how you as a marshal can support the spellcasters in your party, how you can cheerlead for them. There is a tendency within the culture of Pathfinder to talk about how casters can be hard to buff or support in any meaningful way. My hot take is that it's a cultural issue. I don't think casters are all that hard to support. It really isn't meaningfully harder to help spellcasters, and I hope that by the end of this video, I have convinced you that that's the case. Of course, it can be a little bit unintuitive that you have to help spellcasters in certain ways. That's why this video exists. If it was simple, I probably wouldn't need to be making this video. That being said, this game is full of ways that you can help your spellcasters. It's just that a lot of people tend to have a resistance towards some of these techniques, about not doing them, about them not feeling as impactful as they really are. I will get into these cultural aspects a bit later in the video about how it's kind of a mindset thing where players do need to get better at supporting their spellcasters, better at wanting to support their spellcasters, because the tools are all there. And even if they are unintuitive and sometimes obtuse to see, once you know these tools, you should be using them. It makes everyone's experience better. For now, we can just start looking at the various ways that you can help your spellcasters. The first thing I want to address is casters making spell attack rolls. This is because a common refrain used against buffing your spellcasters is attack rolls are the easiest thing in the game to buff, and enemy armor class tends to be one of the easiest things to debuff. Therefore, marshals are easier to buff because marshals are the ones who make attack rolls, whereas casters are not the ones who make attack rolls. This often follows from a somewhat hyperbolized interpretation of designer intent, where spellcasters are intended to use saving throws a lot of the time, and they're not intended to spam attack rolls, and they don't get item bonuses to their attack rolls because the game was designed with the understanding that they would be using all these tools. They would be using saves whenever attack rolls are unfavorable. But that does not mean casters never use attack rolls. Absolutely every spellcaster in the game can make attack rolls. Arcane and Primal spellcasters in particular have really good attack roll spells. And if you're playing in a game with the optional mythic rules, there's a lot of good attack roll spells in there. And party-wide attack roll buffs and enemy AC debuffs will just by default help your spellcasters. You're helping your spellcasters. It's not like casters are excluded from it. When a bard throws out a fortissimo composition for a +3 for the whole party's attack rolls and throws a synesthesia on the enemy boss from -3 to their AC, and the fighter trips that boss, so now they have off guard. If there's a wizard in the back, they now have a +8 to their effective attack roll. That way overcomes any downside of not having the item bonus to your attack rolls. If you want to, just throw out Horizon Thundersphere. It's going to be very effective because you have a +8 to your effective attack. But that's how party-wide buffs impact casters. Are there any unique ways to aid casters with their attacks? How do you help casters in a way that slightly outpaces what you would do for marshals? Marshals make more strikes than spellcasters. A consequence of this is that anytime there's a long duration single target buff or debuff, you should do it in a marshal favoring way. For example, heroism. Heroism lasts for several minutes and it's a single target boost to attack rolls. So you should be throwing it on your marshal because in a, say, 4-round combat, a marshal might make 9 to 12 attack rolls, whereas a caster might make something more like 2 to 4 of those, even if they're adjusting their strategy, like I mentioned in my first point. So definitely don't throw long duration single target attack roll buffs at your spellcasters. What do you throw on spellcasters? In my opinion, there's 2 overlooked ways to boost them. The first is inflicting off guard on the enemy. This is to some extent self-explanatory, but I did want to get into it because there's a tendency of thinking that, oh, the melees have off guard because they're always flanking. We don't need to worry about tripping or grappling the enemy. But you do, because if there's a wizard in the back or a druid in the back and they want to throw out a Horizon Thunder Sphere or a Camel Spit, they might benefit a lot from that -2. And it's pretty impactful. Now, this is not unique to spellcasters. Ranged marshals also benefit from this, but I felt the need to bring it up because it often doesn't enter the conversation. Inflicting off guard is a really good way of helping your casters deal more damage. The second, and I do think casters are uniquely better than marshals at this, is aid. Yes, I'm dropping the hot take that you should be aiding your spellcaster attacks, not your martial attacks. Why do we aid spellcaster attack rolls? Your gut feeling may say, nope, let's aid marshals. Marshals are more effective with their attacks. They make more attacks. Let's aid marshals. But remember, that second part doesn't really apply to this. Them making more attacks doesn't help with aid because aid is just a one-shot buff. It's not a long-duration buff like heroism. And them being more effective at making attacks kind of works against them, as you'll soon see. Let's do some setup first. We're looking at a level 14 party. This is intentional. I chose level 14 because if you go level by level and look at how caster attack rolls scale with respect to a marshal's first strike, the one that has no multiple attack penalty, this is the worst level for that. You're going to be 4 points behind what the marshal can do. There's some levels where you're 3 points behind, some levels where you're 2 points behind, but this is the single worst level for spell attack rolls. So I figured if I can show that a caster is worth aiding at these levels, my viewers can extrapolate from this and say, if a caster is still worth aiding at the worst levels, they're actually even better than what I'm showing you. I'm going to assume the aid automatically crit succeeds. Why? Because there's no action differential between aiding a marshal and aiding a caster. There's no reliability differential between aiding a marshal or aiding a caster. Your reliability only depends on any specific features that you may have, which you usually get via feats that are not related to being a spellcaster or marshal in any way. We're assuming the enemy is a level 16 boss with high armor class, 39. As always, I assume the boss is 2 levels above the party. This makes the enemy somewhat challenging, a valid single target, but not so challenging that reliability is just kind of always a wash. Like against a level 18 enemy, this conversation would be a little bit different. I'm assuming the marshal is a giant instinct barbarian carrying a greatsword. I understand the greatsword is not always the most optimal weapon. I just wanted to give something that does the highest flat damage and somewhat simplifies the math. I didn't want to account for traits like deadly, fatal. They will shift the math slightly, but you will see soon that the differential is not high enough for it to be a big issue. This barbarian is going to have a plus 27 to hit and will do an average of 44.5 damage on a hit and double that on a crit. Now I'm going to assume a classless, subclassless spellcaster casting Horizon Thunder Sphere at a maximum rank spell slot, which at this level would be a 7th rank spell slot. They will have a plus 23 to hit. Again, this is the worst level for caster accuracy. They will also have an average of 52.5 damage. You'll see it is slightly higher than what this melee barbarian can do. Remember, barbarians are the highest damage dealing class if you look at just damage, not anything else. They deal the highest per hit damage in melee. So now let's look at the numbers. First, without aid. So red is the chance of missing, green is the hit chance, and blue is the crit chance. You can see that the Horizon Thunder Sphere hits on a 16 or higher given the numbers I showed earlier. So it has a 20% chance of hitting and a 5% chance of critting. The Marshal, the Giant Instinct Barbarian, instead has 4 points higher accuracy than that, so 40% chance of hitting and 5% chance of critting. Once you incorporate the plus 3 aid, because remember, we assumed it came from somebody with master proficiency who automatically crit succeeded, you will get the caster having a 35% chance of hitting and a 5% chance of critting. Meanwhile, the barbarian has a 50% chance of hitting and a 10% chance of critting. You'll see that this aid passed over the mark where it's actually increasing the crit chance. I'll talk about that a little bit more. So looking at those graphs from before, who benefited more? Who was better to aid? So first, let's look at the chance that your aid will actually change the outcome. Aiding a marshal has a 20% chance of changing the outcome. And this may come as a bit of a surprise to those who are not savvy with Pathfinder's math, because a +3 on a d20 is 15%. Where's that 20% coming from? In Pathfinder, when you're looking at certain sets of outcomes, a +1 doesn't change one outcome on the die. It changes two outcomes. In this case, the barbarian was hitting on a 12. Give them a +1, they're hitting on an 11. Give them a +2, they're hitting on a 10. So with the +2, they've just changed a 10 and 11 from a miss into a hit. But now at this point, if you give them that third +1, it becomes a +3. Now you've changed 9 into a hit, but you've also changed 19 into a crit. Something that used to be a hit became a crit. So aiding a martial has a 20% chance of changing the outcome. And remember, in Pathfinder, this happens a lot of the time. Attacks are kind of an exception where a lot of the time it doesn't happen and then some of the times it happens. But in other places it'll happen all the time. +1s are often worth twice as much in Pathfinder. Aiding the caster, simple 15% chance of changing the outcome. You never change crit chance because you went from hitting on a 16 to hitting on a 13. Your crit stayed exactly at 20. So 15% chance of changing the outcome. Looking at it that way, it looks at the martial benefits more. But let's look at it another way. If you look at the initial point at which they started, hitting on a 12 and hitting on a 16, and then you calculated the average damage differential caused by giving them the +3, and by weighing the added crit chance as being twice as much as added hit chance to make sure we're accounting for crits separately, the martial would have got a 40% accuracy boost from this aid. Meanwhile, the caster got a 50% accuracy boost. Why is that? Let's say this is something you will see intuitively if we took it to the extremes. You were hitting on a 5 and critting on a 15. Would you ever ask somebody to aid you? Would you ever ask somebody to spend that action or a reaction trying to give you that extra +3? Of course not. It's not worth it. You're already hitting on a 5 and critting on a 15. You would just tell them to do their own thing, right? Imagine the other extreme too. If you were hitting on a 19 and critting on a 20, would you ask for that +3 and tell them, hey, don't give the +3 to somebody who is hitting more easily than me. Please give me the +3. Absolutely, yes, you would, because you're quadrupling your chances of actually landing a hit, right? Those extremes make it obvious what's happening over here. The person with less reliability benefits more from an accuracy boost, because all in all, you're giving them more average damage increase when you give them that accuracy boost. This might be the first time on this channel I have looked at DPR as a meaningful metric. This is kind of a milestone for me. But anyways, depending on how you look at it, the martial benefited more or the caster benefited more. The martial was the more reliable aid because you're likelier to actually do something. The caster is the better aid on average because you're likelier to add more damage if you aid the caster every time for, say, 20 combats versus aiding a martial every time for 20 combats. There's good arguments for aiding either of them. I don't think casters are clearly ahead in this case. What if the martial was hitting on a 10 instead of hitting on a 12? Then instead of a 20% chance of changing the outcome, you have a 30% chance. 7, 8, and 9 became hits. 17, 18, and 19 became crits. 6 outcomes were changed, 30% chance of changing the outcome. But likewise, what if the caster is using a 3-action Horizon Thunder Sphere, the one that does half damage on a miss? Now, 3 critical misses became misses, and 3 misses became hits. Also a 30% chance. So at level 14, where caster accuracy is at its worst, there's an argument to aiding either. So judging purely off of how big a reliability boost you got, kind of a wash. It's unclear whom you should aid, but at least that shows that casters are worth aiding. If I can convince you that a caster was as worth aiding as a giant barbarian, clearly there's something more here, right? But it's not yet the full story. There's actually more evidence suggesting that casters are the ones worth aiding. The caster hits a lot harder here. +8 average damage is a ton more damage, especially once you reach these high levels where enemy HP pools get inflated so much that those small damage boosts tend to be the difference between a combat lasting multiple turns longer. The barbarian, when you aid them, you have a 20% chance of adding 44.5 damage. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to use the greatsword. The greatsword doubles its damage on a crit. So If you were dealing 44.5 damage on a hit, that 19, and then that +3 changed that 19 into a crit, right? You're now dealing double that, which means you still only added 44.5 damage. So you have a 20% chance of adding 44.5 damage. With a different weapon, a deadly or a fatal weapon, the conversation would be a little bit different. You'd have a 15% chance of adding your base hit damage, and then a 5% chance of adding a monstrous amount of crit damage. We'll get into that a little bit later. The Spellcaster, you have a 15% chance to add 52.5 damage. That's a lot more. +8 is not something to scoff at. Now, I would kind of lean to aiding the caster just based on that. Like, it's a 5% less chance your aid will have an impact, but when your aid will have an impact, it's actually doing a ton more damage. And there's a few more caveats. The caster and the barbarian is selected here, just like my choice of level 14. I chose this to keep the difference as close as possible. Most martials don't hit as hard as the giant barbarian does. I think it's just really the giant barbarian, the magus, and the gunslinger who hit this hard. And the gunslinger and magus pay a hefty action tax for this. The fighter deals 35.5 average damage on a hit at this level if they're using a greatsword. The rogue deals 36 damage with assuming some or the other d6 weapon, which tends to be the largest weapon you can get on a rogue. Meanwhile, casters actually get hit harder than 52.5. Remember when I said a subclassless, classless spellcaster is throwing a Horizon Thundersphere? So a sorcerer with Sorcerer's Potency immediately adds an average of 7 to that. An Amped and Unleashed Ignition also deals that much damage because psychics are designed for spell attack rolls. The example I used is where the gap is as narrow as possible, just like how the level 14 I chose is where caster reliability is at its worst. Most casters hit harder than 52.5. Most martials don't hit as hard as the giant barbarian at 44.5. So what's the final verdict? Why should we aid spellcaster attack rolls? There are 3 reasons for this. The first 2 have already been gone into in detail, but I will re-summarize their points as I state them here. If your accuracy is lower, you benefit more from an accuracy boost. This might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but yes, you should be benefiting the people who are less likely to hit. You can see this in the most extreme case. The same applies when you bring those numbers closer together. There is the caveat that sometimes the marshal's accuracy might benefit disproportionately from crit chance, and that can matter. It's something you should keep in mind, but this point is still overall slightly in favor of the spellcaster. The second is that the one with higher damage is the better one to aid, because when you change an outcome, you will benefit more. If you have the same chance of changing the outcome for both, let's say the marshal was hitting on a 13, you have to help the spellcaster, because you have a 15% chance in both cases, and the spellcaster just does more damage. So that's a factor that's cleanly in favor of the spellcaster. Spellcasters generally tend to do way more damage on an attack. I think no one except a spell-striking magus is going to do more damage than a spellcaster who has a good attack roll spell and chose to use it for an attack roll. And finally, and this is the point I haven't covered so far, if you make fewer attack rolls, it's actually a higher priority to change an outcome in your attack. Let's say in a given turn cycle, a barbarian is going to run up to the enemy and make 2 strikes. And then you are going to stand back and go, I don't know, Sure Strike plus Horizon Thundersphere. An aid done on your Horizon Thundersphere just represents a bigger proportion of your party's action economy. It's not a disaster if the barbarian misses one attack. They might just hit the second. They might hit both. They might crit one and miss the other. It's not a huge priority to boost individual actions like that. Whereas if you miss a 2 or 3 action attack roll like the one I described, like if you go Sure Strike, Horizon Thundersphere, roll 2 natural 6s, you're gonna feel real bad. Having an aid on the action-dense attack roll is better. So lower accuracy benefits better from accuracy boost. Higher damage benefits better from accuracy boost. Higher action cost benefits better from accuracy boost. And all these together, all of these combined means aid your damn spellcasters. Spellcasters are good to aid. When you have a feeling they're going to use an attack roll, aid them. Communicate with them. When I described that scenario earlier of the bard has a fortissimo and a synesthesia up and the enemy's off guard. I have a +8 to my attack roll. Usually what I do is I ask the marshal in the party to be like, hey, can you just aid me? Make my +8 into a +10 or +11. And they do it because that's good teamwork. Caveat, if your marshal is a magus, specifically a magus, yeah, aid the magus, not the spellcaster. Maguses take a spell, bolt them onto a hard-hitting weapon, and then just staple the damage together and deal that in a 2-action spell strike. Very hard to keep up with that level of burst. So other than the magus, there's no marshal that's as good to aid as a spellcaster. Maybe a gunslinger comes close. I haven't run the math on that quite yet, but I still think the spellcaster is going to be a win in that regard. So yeah, aid your spellcaster's attack rolls. We're far from done. We're nowhere near done talking about how you can boost a spellcaster's offenses. I just talked about attack rolls a lot, but we don't have to limit ourselves to those. The reason I talked about attack rolls for so long is because most parties are already thinking about attack rolls. They're already looking at attack rolls. They're the first layer of how you start doing teamwork. When you talk about teamwork to a new Pathfinder player, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Flanking. Because boosting attack rolls just comes naturally to you. Making other people hit feels good. And I figured having the most straightforward way go first made sense. Aid your spellcasters. When there's an arcane or primal spellcaster in the back, or when there's a psychic in the back, just think about aiding them. But we're nowhere near done. There's so many other ways to aid the spellcaster's offenses. There's this narrative that, oh, it's so hard to benefit save targeting spells that there's only a few ways of doing it. I don't think that's as true as people make it out to be. There are a few obvious options, and these are kind of class agnostic. Anyone can do it. There's Demoralize, there's Bon mot, and there's Dirty Trick. Demoralize is you make an intimidation check and give a -1 status penalty to everything an enemy does, including all their saving throws. Bon mot is a -2 specifically to will saves. And finally, Dirty Trick is a way of getting clumsy onto an enemy, which gives a -1 status penalty to reflex. Now, Dirty Trick and Demoralize have some overlap, but Demoralize has an immunity. So if you as a marshal demoralize an enemy, they're now immune to being demoralized, but you can still Dirty Trick them to give them that -1 to reflex if your spellcaster wants it. These three are the universal ways of doing it. And yes, these are not as blatantly powerful as the ways you can boost attack rolls with. This is not as powerful as Heroism. This is not as powerful as Fortissimo Composition. But remember that whole +1s counting for 2 thing we discussed earlier, where sometimes on an attack roll, only when the attack roll was already hitting on a 10 or lower, a +1 will change 2 outcomes on the dice. If you were hitting on a 10, a +1 will make you hit on a 9 and a 19. If you were hitting on a 9, the +1 will make you hit on an 8 and an 18. Every save always benefits from this if it has a success effect. That Demoralize, that -1 to enemy saves, is changing 2 outcomes on the dice. There is a chance you will change a fail into a critical fail, and there's a chance you'll change a success into a fail. Or if the enemy's higher level, then critical success into success and success into fail. A spell will almost always benefit from that double counting thing. So these things are actually more powerful than they look on paper. And we haven't gotten into the biggest way to give the enemy a penalty to their saving throw. I'm, of course, talking about Recall Knowledge. Yes, this is its own slide. It's not a sub-point of boosting caster offenses. No, I'm not joking. It really is that good. There's this perception in the community that Recall Knowledge is not really caster support. It's just kind of its own thing that sometimes helps spellcasters. All I can say is I sincerely disagree. It is one of the most powerful ways to support your spellcaster. It can even be better than what I'm about to say, but its baseline is still just very good, with the high risk, but that's part of the fun of the game, you know? Imagine if there was a 1-action option in the game that said, look at the enemy creature type, then referring to this table, make the corresponding skill check. If you succeed, the next saving throw that enemy makes has a -3 untyped penalty. We don't have to imagine that. That's what Recall Knowledge is. If your spellcaster friend was going to target the enemy's highest save and you found the middle save for them, or if they were going to target that middle save but you found the low save for them, now they have a -3 untyped penalty to the next save they're going to make. If you went from highest to lowest, it's actually a -6, but that doesn't always happen. It's often easy enough to infer the highest possible saving throw, so not always going to happen. This tends to be a really good way to support charisma-oriented spellcasters. Intelligence casters can kind of make their own recall knowledge checks pretty well. Wisdom ones, depending on the campaign, are either excellent at it or okay at it. Charisma casters tend to be meh at making recall knowledge checks, so you can help them. You can make your own. You can maybe even verify questions that they have asked. The other thing is, these charisma casters are often going to be using those demoralize and bon mot actions I mentioned in the previous slide. You get a better marginal return by you making the thing they're not very good at and let them handle the charisma checks because they're better than you at those. You're probably not a +4 in charisma, but it's still useful to help your intelligent wisdom casters with these. They don't have every skill trained, right? Maybe the wizard has arcana, occultism, and religion, but you cover nature for them because you're a ranger. This is still a very useful way to help intelligent wisdom casters, and it's an exceptional way of helping charisma spellcasters. It'll often feel like a -3 untyped penalty. And yes, there is a risk you might end up giving your spellcaster friend false information. I often find that false information is a little easy to spot. Maybe some players and some tables would consider this metagaming. So this is the your emotions may vary case. Maybe recall knowledge isn't that good at your tables because you guys have a very strict definition of metagaming. The next point is that recall knowledge tends to be very easily upgraded via skill feats. The two standouts for me are additional lore and dubious knowledge. Additional lore is a really good way of reducing the DC for recall knowledge in a long-running campaign. I don't think this is that usable in a West Marches setting or in a one-shot setting or even in, say, a Pathfinder Society, unless you have a way of shifting the lore around day to day. But in a campaign, it's really useful. When you're playing Abomination Vaults, get Aberration lore. It's going to reduce the DC for you so often. It's going to feel better than Occultism in a lot of cases. Dubious Knowledge goes even further into what I talked about, the whole false information thing. When you get one lie and one truth, it's often relatively easy to spot what the one lie is. Not always, there is a risk to this, but you will at least be able to converge on the truth after a turn or two. So Dubious Knowledge is an excellent skill feed because it means unless you crit fail, you're almost always getting information. The last thing I want to say about Recall Knowledge is make sure you use useful questions. If you have an Arcane Spellcaster, asking the GM for the lowest save of the enemy is a useful question because Arcane Spellcasters can very easily target any save they wish to. If you have a Primal Spellcaster, they're not that great at targeting Will, so if you suspect the answer might end up being Will, don't ask for the lowest save. Ask for maybe the middle or the highest save so that you can infer a bit more. Maybe ask for an elemental weakness because primal spellcasters are really good at exploiting those elemental weaknesses. Much better than, say, an occult or divine spellcaster would be. Don't ask about elemental weaknesses for those spellcasters. Ask other questions. Coordinate with your spellcaster. Ask them what questions they want you to ask when you use Recall Knowledge. Asking useful questions is a key to narrowing down what the enemy's lower saves are and making Recall Knowledge feel like that -3 untyped penalty that it is. All in all, one of the best ways you can support your spellcaster. I think it might be the best way in a vacuum. Circumstantially, some of the other ways may be better or worse, but Recall Knowledge is the most generically good way of always supporting your spellcaster. Now, to move a little bit beyond numbers, because numbers are not the only way to help a spellcaster, like giving a -1 to enemy saves or plus whatever to attacks. They're not even often the best way of helping a spellcaster. Certainly do it. Definitely aid your spellcaster's upcoming attack rolls, demoralize enemies, recall knowledge for your spellcasters. These are all good ways to help a spellcaster. But overall, you should be helping characters in a way they want to be helped. If I had a ranged marshal in the back asking for help, I wouldn't be debuffing the enemy's will save. What's that doing for my ranged friend? I would be boosting my friend's attack rolls, debuffing the enemy's AC, maybe debuffing their reflex if that ranged marshal wants to use things like bola shots or bombs or something like that, and maybe turning off the enemy's reactions so my ranged friend doesn't have to worry about reactive strike and other such things. Generally speaking, marshals are balanced to be efficient but not reliable. They spend fewer actions on things, so their reliability is low. If they spend a lot of actions on things, that is, you spend your actions helping them, they get to be more reliable. It's a very simple give and take. The more inefficient you are, the more reliable you get to be. Spellcasters are on the opposite side. As I showed in the previous video, spellcasters have very high reliability, but they're not efficient. So just help their efficiency. Most of their spells are 2 or 3 actions. Just help them use these better. Help them be more efficient overall, and that'll just make your casters feel a lot better. There are 2 key ways to help spellcaster efficiency overall. The first is to preserve your caster friends' actions. I sort of got into this in the previous video. I don't really want to get into comparing 3 action versus 3 action here because the permutations get a little intense, but just suffice it to say that most damage-focused casters have a 3rd action that adds reliable damage. Because your 2 actions come from a spell, you can go through your entire turn without ever suffering multiple attack penalty. No one other than the Flurry Ranger is probably going to approach the 3 action reliability of a caster, and maybe they will approach the potency. That is generally true for all casters. Casters can have these explosive turns if they get to use all their actions offensively. When I'm a wizard, all of my best turns are when I get to go 3 action spell, or when I get to go 2 action spell plus sustain, or 2 action spell plus recall knowledge, or even just 2 action spell plus shoot with the bow. Spellcasters are really good at optimizing the use of all 3 actions if they're given those. So the best thing you can do is preserve your spellcasters' actions. Every time you save them 1 action, you're making that 3 action explosion more likely. The second thing is you can try squeezing more effectiveness out of their spells. Since those spells cost more actions to cast, squeezing out that higher effectiveness is inherently making them more efficient. I sort of talked about this with the aid example. Aid on somebody spending 2 actions in their attack is inherently worth a lot more than somebody spending 1 action in their attack, because when you convert a miss into a hit, you converted a disaster into a good situation, or a bad situation into a great situation, whereas converting one of a marshal's misses into a hit isn't that big a differential. The same applies to all spells. Anytime the caster's 2 actions feel worth more than the 2 actions you spent on them, it's a big success. So first, let's talk about preserving a spellcaster's action economy. The first and most important thing you can do to preserve a spellcaster's action economy is don't be stupid. Just take less damage whenever you can. This might seem obvious, and this is a somewhat passive way of helping your spellcasters, but it's something I've noticed a lot of parties don't do. A spellcaster has the advantage in potency in every regard. This includes healing. This means that anytime the party takes a large amount of damage, the one with the large enough amount of healing to counteract that damage is going to be the spellcaster. And not just healing, this also applies to damage mitigation. If your spellcaster would have to use a 2-action heal on you because you stayed in melee too long, see if you can just choose not to stay in melee too long. Instead of running in, attacking, and attacking a second time, run in, attack, and retreat. Make the enemy spend an action to come to you. That less bit of damage you took, the fact that you perhaps didn't eat a certain reaction, or maybe the enemy didn't get to do a 3-action or 2-action activity they would otherwise have taken, these will preserve your health, which means they will unburden the caster from having to heal you back up in case of an emergency. You will still sometimes, often perhaps, need healing depending on your exact party composition, the difficulty of an encounter, but always be cognizant that there's actions you can take that just minimize the caster's need for healing you. If that 2-action heal becomes a 2-action fireball, your caster is going to feel they contributed more offensively. If that reaction hidebound became a reaction brine dragon's bile, again, they'll feel like they benefited a lot from this. So just make decisions in a way where you treat your spellcaster's damage mitigation as being a last resort, not as a primary way for you to push your advantage. Unless, of course, the caster volunteered to damage mitigate for you, that's a different case. But there's more. There's more active and non-obvious ways of helping your spellcaster preserve actions. Sometimes, oftentimes, a spellcaster will look at the battlefield and say, man, that one enemy's 35 feet away, but if they were 5 feet closer, I could electric arc 2 people. Or sometimes they might move into a place to line up a lightning bolt a little bit better. See if you can use shove and reposition to help out with these things. Anything you can do to prevent that caster from spending that move action is so valuable, because now they have that 3rd action freed up for something else. They're going to improve their offensive output. They might spend a second to demoralize or recall knowledge by themselves without too much help from you. And that move action is not just spent to line things up. That move action is sometimes, most of the time actually, used because the caster feels threatened. Casters, especially in the level range of 1 to 7, tend to be on the squishier side. So they might spend that third action moving away from combat, or casting the shield cantrip or glass shield cantrip, or just something else that's defensive, maybe a 1-action heal on themselves. All of these things, if you can make your caster feel safer, now they will not be using their actions defensively, they'll get to use it offensively. Shove your enemies away. If you can make the enemy waste actions coming to your spellcaster, this can make a big difference. And sometimes a 5-foot shove can make the difference between an action or 2 actions. Let's say the spellcaster is standing 30 feet away from the enemy. You shove the enemy 5 feet and now they're 35 feet away. They might not be able to get to the caster in 1 action now. This also works if you grapple or trip the enemy. Shoving is not always the best way to deny actions, but grappling and tripping are just so much better at doing this if you need to. Grapple the enemy. They cannot get to your spellcaster friend without inflicting map on themselves. Trip the enemy. It's now 2 actions to get to your spellcaster, even if they have a very high movement speed, and shove wouldn't have made a difference. There's also the hidden plus, well, not hidden, there's also the big plus of inflicting off guard, so your spellcaster might use that third action on something that's an attack roll because you gave them off guard. And terrain dependent, occupy a choke point. Sometimes if you're seeing enemies in a room, don't run into the room. Run into the doorway of that room and stay there. The enemy not being able to get through you easily means your caster can just sit back, throw away spells and attacks turn after turn without really having to worry about repositioning. Remember, your goal is to make the caster feel like a turret if they want to be offensive, instead of having to move. Every single time you do this, the caster will feel really good and really explosive. And of course, if a caster might eat a reaction due to a certain set of actions they're about to take, just eat it for them. Better you than them, right? Just stride around the enemy. If the enemy uses their reaction on you, now the spellcaster can just do whatever they want without having to worry about maybe having to use a time jump or something of the sort to get away from the reaction, or even just simple move action. Now they can just stay in place and do whatever they were going to do and use a third action offensively without worrying about taking damage or being disrupted. All of these things help preserve a caster's actions. And remember, every time you save a spellcaster, the 1 action they would have used on something like move or shield or time jump, anytime you do that, you increase the chances of those explosive 3-action turns that I keep talking about that a caster loves so much. The next thing to talk about is making the spells themselves feel more efficient. A spellcaster's action economy can be viewed as 2 plus 1. Most spells are 2 actions. That third action is where there's a bit of playroom. You can use that to sustain another spell. You can use that defensively. You can use that for an auxiliary spell like Sure Strike. Or you can use it for a directly offensive focus spell or focus cantrip like Clinging Ice or Elemental Toss. You can even bolt that onto a spell by basically casting a 3-action spell. If the previous slide was about making that third action feel offensive and potent, this slide is about making those first 2 actions feel even more reliable and even more powerful than before. The first and most underrated way of helping spells feel more efficient is just getting out of the way of area of effect spells. I have got a surprising amount of pushback on this topic. I have mentioned on the subreddit in the past that it's rarely correct to stand in the way of a caster's AoE, and I get pushback in the form of, I was going to make a second strike. Isn't my strike going to do the damage that this AoE would have done to this character? I was going to give flanking to my friend. Isn't flanking better because Marshall's crit all the time? I don't want to eat reactive strikes. It is almost never correct to get in the way of a spellcaster's AoE spell. I know this may sound surprising, but a spellcaster's AoE is not a single target spell. If they were going to hit 3 targets, and then you give them a 4th target to hit by getting out of their way, you're not just adding the effect of a fireball cast on 1 target to it. The math for this is not obvious. I recommend checking out my dehydrate video on why, but I don't want to go into it in too much detail right now. But the general idea is the 4 degrees of success means that adding 1 target to an AoE doesn't feel like hitting 1 target with an AoE. It actually feels disproportionately better than that. So anytime you can make a decision to help your spellcaster hit even 1 more target in an AoE, or 2 or 3 more targets, you should basically always take that decision. The math is that favorable for AoE spells. This is especially true because every additional target massively increases the chance of a critical failure, and critical failure effects in AoEs can be devastating. If your ally is going to cast a Phantasmal Calamity, that critical failure takes an enemy out of combat. Always get out of the way of AoEs. I cannot emphasize that enough. But that is not the only way to help spellcasters feel efficient. I wouldn't be spending a whole slide on this point if it was. There's definitely more. What if the caster casts a persisting AoE like Rust Cloud or Entangling Flora or Wall of Fire? You want to help your spellcaster magnify the value of these persisting AoEs. The first and most obvious way of doing so is using Shove or Reposition to help them double dip. Enemies in a Rust Cloud, they take damage. They spend an action, leaving the Rust Cloud. Now your spellcaster has basically done a bit of damage and denied the enemy an action. Shove that enemy back into the Rust Cloud. Now they'll take damage again and lose another action, probably leaving the Rust Cloud. Maybe they'll choose to stay in there, I don't know for sure, because it depends on the enemy's intelligence, the way the GM feels about the situation, what tactics are appropriate, but effectively you double the value of the Rust Cloud. Instead of dealing damage once and denying one action, you dealt damage twice and denied two actions. And it's very easy to do. All you have to do is Shove or Reposition, and this makes Shove an incredibly powerful way to support casters. I don't see Shove talked about enough, but the fact that it bypasses force movement rules, which can get a little hazy and GM dependent, but Shove just ignores them. So it is one of the most powerful ways of helping an arcane or primal spellcaster because they throw out these AoEs that stay all the time. And occult and divine spellcasters can sort of do that, not as often, as potently as arcane and primal spellcasters do though. But there's more. You can also grapple or trip or use the rooting rune or the bow's critical specialization to make it hard for the enemy to leave. Action denial has a magnifying effect depending on how many actions you deny. If you deny the enemy one action, it's good. If you deny the enemy two actions, that enemy is going to feel worthless because a lot of powerful abilities cost 2 or 3 actions. If you give them just one action, they may just make a strike, and one single strike is not that scary, even from an extreme threat boss. So if the enemy is in this persisting AoE, like a Rust Cloud, and they're going to choose to leave, and then you make it hard for them to leave using one of these options, you may end up denying them 2 or 3 actions, and it'll massively magnify the value of the persisting AoE's action denial component. Another way of magnifying the value is using reactions. If you stand in place and use things like Disrupt Prey or Reactive Strike to make the enemy feel hesitant about leaving, they may choose to just stay in the persisting AoE and suffer its consequences, which will often be damage, but there might be others. Like, for example, if the spellcaster is going to use a Freezing Rain, the enemy staying in there might slow them every single turn, and some of those turns they might even get slowed too. So threatening that reaction and making the enemy make a poor decision of staying in the AoE, because enemies don't always know exactly what a spell is going to do to them, you can end up making the spell feel so much more powerful than it would have if you are not there. The final thing you can do to help your spellcaster is, when they use control or debuff options, help them out by comboing your actions into them. If they cast slow to deny the enemy one action, use a trip. Now you deny the enemy 2 actions. And like I said, 2 actions is a lot better to deny than 1 action. Both of you will feel like you magnified one another's power by doing what you did. If the spellcaster uses Agitate, stand in a place where you will threaten a reaction to them moving as a consequence of Agitate. Now they're not sure whether to lose an action or take the damage because they don't know how much damage you're going to do. The next major point I wanted to talk about was sharing burdensome tasks and obligatory tasks with the spellcasters. This sort of builds on the point of caster efficiency, because if you're sharing the burden, you're effectively preventing them from having to spend all their actions on these tasks that nobody loves doing, with the exception, of course, there are people who love doing certain tasks like this, but if nobody in your party loves doing them, you should be sharing the burden for these rather than just dumping it on the spellcaster. There are some things that a caster ends up being expected to do in certain party compositions. Sometimes these are game design expectations. For example, no one is better than a spellcaster dealing with an invisible enemy. Yes, a spellcaster should be the one dealing with that. Likewise, nobody can hard turn off reactions. A marshal can do soft, I will eat the reaction for you kind of things, but usually spellcasters are the way to turn off reactions. And when the game design expects these of you, as a spellcaster, it's sort of your burden, but you have to take it to do these. A lot of the time, however, the things spellcasters feel burdened with are just cultural expectations. Healing, having backup ways of making sure the party can deal with flying enemies, having ways to deal with this specific encounter or that specific encounter. These are just things casters are expected to do. And one of the best things you can do to make your spellcasters feel better is just share that burden with them. Make their life easier, because again, they often have to spend a lot of actions helping you with these things. You can make their life easier by just spending fewer actions for a little less potency. Healing? Yes, the heal spell is incredible, but if you just carry potions and if you have battle medicine as a marshal helping the other marshals who are in the front line with you, you might end up lessening the amount of times a spellcaster has to cast heal on you. Earthbind or fly or something of the sort to help the party deal with flying enemies. Carry bola so you can range trip them, or carry bola shots if you're a ranged marshal so you can try to trip them with your attack roll. Carry backup weapons. Have ways of dealing with these flying enemies without burdening your spellcaster with the duty of helping you do these things. The more such ways in which you share the burden with them, the better their life becomes, because ultimately they just don't have to spend actions helping you. And one of the most important ways, and I'm sort of double dipping here, demoralize and recall knowledge. Do it for them. Oftentimes, they're going to be better at this than you. Int or Wiz casters may be better at recall knowledge. Charisma casters will be better at demoralize. But if you do it for them, you're going to lessen the burden of these things being expected. The game expects some level of debuffs, and if you demoralize, that means the caster doesn't have to demoralize or cast fear if your thing landed. Maybe they'll get a recall knowledge, or maybe they'll get a third action that's not one of those things. Sharing the burden in buffing, debuffing, healing, and dealing with weird situations like the Earthbind Fly example I mentioned will help spellcasters a lot. Sometimes, like I said in the previous slide, there are just things that are sort of expectations from the spellcaster, right? Anytime you have to ask them for a favor, either because it just works out that way because of your action economy, like maybe you're a barbarian who can't use concentrate actions, so you can't pick up certain tasks for them. Try to reach a compromise. Remember, you're asking the spellcaster for a favor. These expectations you're placing on them, they shouldn't have to unilaterally fulfill them. If you're going to ask them to heal you and you are unable to pick up battle medicine because your hands are full or something, spend some gold and buy them scrolls of heal. That way, they don't have to spend their spell slots healing you. Maybe you will also do your best to make them use those scrolls as little as possible. These scrolls are a much more limited resource. You will play carefully around them. Likewise, if you ask them to cast fly for you because just your build cannot fit in a thrown weapon, buy them scrolls of fly. Anytime they say, hey, let's scout, be patient and let them scout so that maybe they'll pre-buff with fly rather than spending actions on it. You want to save them actions, you want to save them spell slots. And compromising in these regards and bridging that gap, helping them help you, can be a very valuable way of sharing the burden, even if you can't directly contribute to these. Now, this sounds a little bit like a conclusion, like I'm done going through points that help the spellcaster. I am not quite done. There's one very, very key thing that we haven't talked about. Everything we've talked about so far, all 6 of these major points, are class agnostic. Now we can look at class specific points, and there are so many of them. I don't know why people would say marshals cannot help spellcaster, because the majority of martial classes are incredible at helping spellcasters if you just make certain build choices. On top of all these 6 points worth of helping the spellcaster that I've covered so far, plenty of classes have unique ways to either improve on those 6 or add to them. Now, before actually getting into these class-specific things, I wanted to preempt a couple of very common responses that I see when I suggest these options. Anytime I have talked about this in the past, I've seen 2 very common responses. The first is casters tend to have the more powerful buffs, and there's no uniquely powerful martial options, nor are there any ways to help the spellcaster that are unique to those spellcasters. Now, the latter half of the statement, I have to say, I think I have thoroughly disproved it. Like, I think casters are uniquely good at benefiting from aid. I think casters are uniquely good at benefiting from action efficiency. But that first half, the one that casters have more powerful buffs, there's no more powerful way to benefit someone's action efficiency than to cast haste on them. I agree. There's no more reliable way to debuff an enemy's AC than to have a caster use those spells. My immediate response to that is, so what? That's kind of the game's design, isn't it? The caster is spending a spell slot on what they're about to do. Of course they get to be more reliable and more potent than you. A demoralize should not outpace a fear or a synesthesia. That doesn't mean it's not worth using, though. Doing these soft taxes that help your caster's action economy is not going to be as powerful as just casting haste on them, because haste is a spell slot. But what you have is action efficiency. It is literally impossible for a party, unless it's entirely composed of spellcasters, to have every relevant combination of buffs and debuffs floating around. If your party has a cleric who's going to cast heroism, maybe don't worry about using aid, maybe worry about using demoralize or dirty trick. If you have a caster who loves throwing out debuffs like fear, agonizing despair, synesthesia, then maybe you don't focus on those debuffs, you focus on recall knowledge. Every party member gets 3 actions per turn. It is not going to be the case that the spellcaster just does everything. So yes, the spellcaster will be more reliable and more potent when they use something that their action economy allows them to. You use your better action economy to fit in all the things that they did not do. Besides, we actually haven't even gotten to those unique martial options yet. As you'll see, there are plenty of those. And the second common response is, I don't want to spend my build options on these. I don't want to spend my feats, my subclass. That is a huge part of the culture issue I'm talking about. There's just this expectation that a spellcaster will spend their highest rank spell slots and 2 actions almost every single combat, sometimes multiple turns per combat, all the time. We just expect this of spellcasters. We expect that, oh, they're a healing fawn cleric. Of course they'll heal me anytime I want them to. And yes, they should cast heroism on me. That is optimal. But you're not okay to spend class feats and perhaps even a subclass choice to help them back, even though we expect casters to help all the time. And besides, spending feats and subclass choices, like I mentioned, is easier than spending high rank spell slots and the actions for them. 2 actions is a lot more than 1 action. It's not just twice as much, it's effectively taking away a caster's whole turn. A high rank spell slot is close to a quarter of a spellcaster's daily power budget sometimes, depending on the exact level. Maybe it's less at higher levels, but anytime you say, yeah, I expect the caster to cast heroism or synesthesia or anything else to make me feel better, you're asking for a lot more than when a martial is asked to spend feats or subclass choices on it. So to both these common responses, I have to say you have to try and look past the cultural bias of casters being encoded as buffers and cheerleaders. Because yes, martials should be doing this all the time. Pathfinder is a game where everyone should cheerlead everyone, not just casters cheerleading martials. Let's get to the class-specific ways next. Really, there are just so many class-specific options. It is impossible for me to make a video that covers every single one of them. These are just some examples. The list isn't even close to exhaustive. First, let's just get the most obvious one out of the way. Investigators and thaumaturges are entirely dedicated to recall knowledge in many different ways. They get class features and many feats and feat trees to help that. And that just means just bringing any investigator or thaumaturge to the table immediately makes every caster there feel good if you know how to ask the right questions. But it goes beyond just those 2 classes. Let's look at the rogue. The scoundrel subclass gets this feat called Distracting Feint. It lets you inflict a circumstance penalty to reflex saves. It's quite unique in that regard. You can give a -2 circumstance penalty and it'll stack with something like Demoralize or Dirty Trick because those are status penalties. So you are uniquely good at helping backline blasters, especially arcane and primal blasters who target reflex all the time. But it's not just blasters either. Controllers also end up targeting reflex all the time. Rogues are just so good at this. And like I said in the previous slide, losing your subclass isn't that big a deal. If you were going to play a thief or a ruffian and you shift it to scoundrel, you're losing like maybe 2 or 3 points of damage for this insane boost in ability to help your spellcaster. It is a very good trade-off. It's not going to feel as harsh as when a caster has to lose their maximum rank slot to heroism their martial. It is a much cheaper cost. Even ignoring the subclass though, a rogue with the battle assessment can use their perception modifier to make recall knowledge checks on the enemy to figure out their weaknesses, to figure out their lower saves. And this is an incredible way of helping a spellcaster, as we already established. A rogue with the scoundrel racket will be even better at this because you could go demoralize, distracting feint, and use that perception recall knowledge, and you could have such a huge impact if you found an enemy's weakness, like a damage weakness, and then reduce their reflex save so the caster is very likely to stick it. Then there's a debilitations class feature you get at level 9, which can combo with spellcasters in multiple ways. One of my favorite combos as a wizard to use with the rogue in our party was I will throw out a spell like Entangling Flora, which adds difficult terrain and reduces the enemy's speed, and then they will use the debilitation that reduces the enemy's speed further, and now they're just stranded in difficult terrain depending on how they saved and whatnot. Likewise, the debilitations that inflict clumsy or enfeebled can end up helping the spellcaster, or even the ones that inflict damage weaknesses, because spellcasters can use those too. The next we'll look at is Ranger. Just like the Rogue, there is a spellcaster helping class built into Ranger, the Outwit Edge. Having a circumstance bonus to all your recall knowledge checks is incredible. Having a circumstance bonus to all your demoralized checks is incredible. Also, the Ranger is uniquely suited in having a lot of actions to support casters with. If you hunt prey and then get a recall knowledge for free as part of it, and then let's say you're operating at range, you can have a turn that looks something like hunt prey, demoralize, and make 2 shots. You don't really lose much damage by having outwit here instead of flurry or precision. Like, the amount of damage you lose is minor compared to the kind of advantage you'll be generating for your spellcaster friend, and you still got to make 2 strikes in your turn. It's incredibly action efficient and a great way to support your spellcaster friends. The Monster Hunter feat tree just exemplifies this advantage of the Ranger in using recall knowledge to help their friends. The next class we'll look at is the Fighter. A lot of the Fighter's way of benefiting the spellcaster come from various meta strikes. I can't believe I forgot to mention the meta strike that lets you make a recall knowledge for free. I've forgotten the name now. It's something assessment, but that's a really good way to recall knowledge for your friends. But there's also Intimidating Strike, which will give Frighten to the enemy. There's Slam Down, which will give Off Guard to the enemy. There's Sleek Reposition, which you can use to combo into your spellcaster's AoEs or even the persisting AoEs depending on your GM's exact interpretation of the force movement rules. Let's look at the Swashbuckler. Swashbucklers are the best at aiding in the game. And like I said, spellcasters are the best people to be aiding. Combine the two, give the Swashbuckler one for all, and the spellcaster will just feel incredible. Daring Doe will also mean that this Swashbuckler is good at repeatedly aiding the caster. A little known rule about aid is that anytime you aid the same friend against the same enemy, the GM is expected to use a higher DC. You can't just trick the same enemy to fall for the same tricks again and again and again. Daring Doe and One for All together can overcome these DCs so easily and make the Swashbuckler good at aiding somebody who loves spamming these attack rolls, like a Psychic. For example, the Swashbuckler can wait for the Psychic to unleash their Psyche, throw out an aid on turn 1 of the Unleashed Psyche, throw out an aid on turn 2, maybe even one after, depending on if they have any focus points left, and while the DC is going up every single turn, Daring Doe will make it really easy for the Swashbuckler to overcome it. Is this pronounced Daring Do or Daring Doe? I don't know what that word is. Daring Do, I guess. Finally, there's the Champion, and the Champion is also very uniquely well suited to helping the spellcasters. Redeemers get the Weight of Guilt feat, which they can use to inflict Stupefied on the enemy without even offering them a saving throw of any kind. This is a great way to combo with your caster's will saves. It's similar to Bon Mo, but you don't need to use an action to do it. You use a reaction to do it, and there's no chance that you will fail to inflict this. So Redeemers are really good at helping casters who like using will targeting spells, like an Occult spellcaster, for example. Liberators are also very good because their reaction helps the spellcaster move around anytime they take a hit, which can help a caster's economy. You can make a caster's life easier by reducing the number of actions they have to spend moving in and out of combat. You can even save them from a restrain or a grab, which is a really punishing thing for a spellcaster to be in. Finally, Lay on Hands is a way to supplement all the healing a spellcaster might be doing in emergencies because you have the efficiency. Yes, a druid standing in the back using a 2-action heal will heal for way more, but you will heal for 1 action. So anytime you use Lay on Hands, you'll be trading 1 action for 2 of the druids, and that's a really valuable trade-off. You'll be saving your druid a lot of actions. Again, not an exhaustive list. I cannot make an exhaustive list of how many different ways there are to help a spellcaster using class-specific options. I just hope that this, combined with all the options I listed earlier, makes it easier for people to look at their characters and decide, oh yeah, these are the ways I'm going to help out spellcasters. So that's all I have to say on the topic of cheerleading for spellcasters. I hope you found my points convincing. I hope I showed new ways of supporting spellcasters to some of you who may have already enjoyed supporting your spellcasters. I hope that some of you who thought that spellcasters are hard to support had your minds changed. I really genuinely believe that this is a cultural expectation from us as a community that we expect spellcasters to support marshals and don't really critically evaluate whether it's possible for marshals to support spellcasters. So I hope this video changed some minds. That will be the end of the Casters Are Not Your Cheerleader series. For now, I have a bit of a part 3 planned, but that will be well into the future. For right now, these videos tend to be quite long and hard to script, record, and edit, so this is a short end for the Casters Are Not Your Cheerleaders. My next few videos are likely going to be shorter, and I have a little surprise in store coming up soon, and maybe you already know what it is if you've seen some of the teasers I may have dropped in other channels of communication, but if you don't, you'll find out very soon. Until then, please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed my content. Please comment with any feedback you may have or any disagreements you may have. I'm always happy to engage with the discussion. Until next time.